So, at the end of the hour last time, we had seen the construction of the first monumental architecture in which Christians could worship, built in Jerusalem by the Roman Emperor Constantine, who had converted to Christianity on the eve of a battle that he fought in Rome, a battle that was waged in a civil war against another emperor of Rome. They were co-emperors, Constantine and this other guy, and Constantine wins the battle, and on the eve of the battle, he vowed that his conquest would be successful, and it would be so because he was bringing forth his army under the sign of Christ. And after his successful battle, he dispatched his mother, Helena, to Jerusalem to locate the burial of Jesus, which she successfully did according to tradition and according to the archaeological excavations that she oversaw in Jerusalem in the 4th century, in the early 4th century. And underneath this vast rotunda, built on analogy with the Pantheon in Rome, the tomb was discovered, an empty tomb. And a shrine was built, and then this rotunda commemorating it. Ben? Say what?
I don't know if you're making any suggestions here, but if supposedly she finds this tomb and everything, why do they always have History Channel shows like, this is the tomb of Jesus?
You mean History Channel shows asking if it is or it isn't?
Yeah, well, like, I mean,
why is it?
every year or so they have like this big thing like, we found this tomb that says Jesus somewhere on it. It must be his.
Oh, are you talking now about the latest flap about the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus, and then the tomb that was found, or you're just talking about in general? Why is that? Well,
Besides obviously ladies and stuff like that.
right. You know, all semester long I have tried to be, I have hoped that I have been pretty careful about connecting anything in what is generally known as Scripture, Old Hebrew Bible, New Testament, to any actual things on the ground. Because the traditions are late and hazy, and there is no evidence in just about any case for material commemoration or observation of an event close enough to the time that it would have occurred that we can connect what somebody wrote about it with what we find on the ground, which has nothing to do with later veneration. It's just the specificity of the connection. In the case of the tomb of Jesus, the archaeological and historical evidence is quite compelling. It's remarkably compelling. Because the tomb, as I showed you last time, is located in a part of the city that was quite rapidly enclosed within walls and could not have remained a burial spot, but definitely was outside the city walls at the time of the death of Christ and was a burial spot. I mean, there are tombs there, more than one tomb. You can still see them. You can still see the carvings today if you go inside the rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You can go into some side rooms and see them. And because a small Christian community stayed in and around the city, and a bishopric was already established in the 3rd century, and the tradition then was very clear and univocal that the spot under the Temple of Venus at the corner of the Forum of Aelia Capitolina, in fact, covered the tomb of Christ. Now, if it wasn't the exact tomb of Christ, it has to have been very, very close. I mean, the historical evidence for him to have existed and died and been buried in Jerusalem is very, very strong. So he's buried someplace. He was buried someplace around here. And since the tradition is so consistent and so early and so unlikely, it's not the likeliest spot. It's already unlikely at the time that the tradition grew up because it's inside the walls of the city. And there's no argument about it in any ancient sources, and we have multiple sources. Therefore, of all of the possible correlations between events of historical and cosmic import that have occurred in this region and all the places that are assigned to it, this is the one with the strongest, the only one really, with a very strong chance of being quite accurate. That, in and of itself, makes a lot of people suspicious and nervous and just sort of, I don't know, can that really be? You know, that's what people, and that I think is the reason for the multiplicity of TV programs. Because there's so much evidence for it, and there's such a not unreasonable modern reaction of almost disbelief. Can that really be? That there's, you have plenty enough for an hour-long or even longer TV series. Does that answer your question?
And to that end, it's not like he was the only one by the name of Yeshua.
He was not. It's not an uncommon name. Was not an uncommon name. It's attested on other epigraphic remains of this region and of the period in which he lived. Right. I mean, there's nothing in any of the traditions that is in the least unlikely, as a matter of fact. So the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was an immediate sensation in the larger Roman Empire, as is wonderfully and vividly evidenced by this little graffito of a ship with an inscription in Latin suggesting that the people who wrote it came, obviously via ship, from the western part of the empire. Domine ivimus, Lord, we have come. We have come, and we have come here in the early 4th century to Jerusalem, where Jesus died. But Jesus, of course, lived for 20-some-odd years before that, and many of his life events are recorded in, some of them in triplicate, in the Gospels. And those traditions are also univocal, that he was born, raised, lived, and taught in the region of Galilee. Mark, one of the 3 synoptic Gospels, Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. He walked beside the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. At once they left their nets and followed him. Others came along, and they went to Capernaum, which is that's the English version of a Hebrew village name, Kfar Nahum. Kfar is the Hebrew word for village, and Nahum is a Hebrew name. And the village's name is the village of Nahum. Nahum is the same root as Nehemiah, who you remember from the Persian period, so it's old name. When the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law, meaning the rabbis. News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. Capernaum is a real place on the northern shore of the Kinneret, of the Sea of Galilee, here. And you see here the excavation area that since the 1960s has been the project of the Studium Biblicum Franciscanum, the Franciscan friars whose main school and church and mission is based in Jerusalem. The Franciscans, among their many excellencies, are also pretty good archaeologists, and they publish a lot as well. And they have an incredible website, the SBF Blogspot, if you can believe it. And there's a link to the SBF Blogspot about Capernaum on your website, on our class website. And there are actually two Capernaum links, one from the Franciscan Fathers and one from the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities of the State of Israel. And they are both quite authoritative. Nothing in them is incorrect. They are excellent sources for information about Capernaum, the buildings there, the excavations there. What is just a little bit interesting about each of them is the difference in what they focus on. So I encourage you to check them both out. So you see here the outline of the excavation area, the SBF excavation area of Capernaum. And since this aerial photo was taken, all of this area has been excavated as well. So now this is all continuous excavation. And the village is an old one. It is a Hellenistic period village. Actually, it is already established in the Persian period. It is a nice, tidy village right down on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It spreads for about 300 meters, right, hugging the shore. It is identical in many ways to Gamla. Same style of architecture, basalt, stone walls, small houses with courtyards and paved areas, not anything like Paris-style courtyards, but just working courtyards with a couple columns that would have held up a roof on one side, such as here, for example. So you can imagine a kind of overhang here, interior installations like this shelf. This is a part of the village that is pretty organized. You can see a street. And actually may have been, this might have been a commercial area right here. There might have been little shops. But altogether, a very prosperous town for its time. Again, the same sorts of finds inside the houses as at Gamla. And a self-sufficient town. People who lived here were not only fishermen, but were agriculturalists. These are mills for grinding flour. Lots and lots of them have been found in the town. Here's the way these mills work, for those of you that don't know this. You put your wheat down in the upper cone here. This upper cone rests on a lower inverted cone, such as this. This is a lower cone. And there's a little bit of space between the inside of the upper cone and the lower cone. Donkeys or people push beams that are inserted through the holes on either side here so that it rotates. And as it rotates, the wheat that's been poured into the top is ground against the inside lower cone and turned into flour. And some sort of a matting would have been laid around on the ground, and the flour would then fall out from the lower cone on the ground, and then you could pick it up and collect it, and that was the way that you got flour. There are also lots of oil presses. This is one of them. The oils would go in here. Again, this large stone would go around and around. A big wooden beam coming through the central hole would be pulled by a donkey, just trotting around and around, and that would press the oil. So olive oil and flour and certainly fish. And here you see a Reconstruction drawing. This is, in fact, from the SBF Blogspot. This is Area 3 from the new excavations that took place in 2003. They're very up on things, those Franciscans. They're awesome. So you can see some installations inside some of the houses, smaller houses with just one room, sort of labyrinthine, interconnected, not really very planned, nothing ostentatious, very, very simple. Inside this the simple area of the town lived, according to the Gospels, Peter and Andrew, who were two of the earliest followers of Jesus. And it was to the house of both Peter and Andrew that Jesus is recorded to have come and laid hands on people who were ill and helped cure them. And in the first century CE, within a few years of, well, actually, probably within a very few years of the crucifixion and death of Jesus. And you might want to refer to your handout here and look at the top picture on your handout. One of these houses inside this area right here, and here you see the plan of these houses. One of these houses that had here 2 rooms. This had originally been 2 rooms, and the door and the wall had been about there. So there was a doorway out of the northern room and 2 doorways out of the southern room. This room was turned into a shrine. The evidence for it is that the basalt paving of the floor, just like the basalt paving that you see in this photograph here, was covered over with plaster. There were several layers of plaster that were put over the floor, and in between the various layers of plaster that were put there over time were fragments of pottery that would just happen to be hanging around, and that pottery is datable. That's how we know that the floor was already laid in the 1st century CE, because that's the date of the pottery that's in between the various levels of plaster floor. And the walls of the room were plastered as well. And on those plastered walls, graffiti were incised by pilgrims, already beginning in the 1st century CE. And the graffiti occurs in 5 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, and Syriac, which is the language of the area of Syria around Damascus. And the graffiti were addressed to Jesus as Lord and as Christ. In the area surrounding this room, which was about 7 meters across, people continued to live. I mean, this just continued to be a house. It was just this one room that was transformed into what the Franciscans have called a venerated hall. But by the 4th, and that's how it stayed for a couple of hundred years. Through the Roman era, Sepphoris is built, the house, the villa of Dionysus with those beautiful mosaics, the theater, the colonnaded streets, Bet Shan is elaborated, Jerash. So there is the very rich array of comfortable Roman life surrounding in this region, and the bulk of the population up here are Romanized Jews, as we know from Sepphoris and Bet Sharim up here in the area of Galilee. And throughout this period, the house of Peter remained this small, essentially local shrine. But even though it was local, we can tell from the fact that there are Syriac and Latin graffiti on the walls that the occasional traveler or pilgrim from much further away came to this spot, lured by the associations, strong associations and written associations in the Gospels of Capernaum with the life of Jesus. About a generation after Constantine declared Christianity a safe and protected religion of the Roman Empire and had built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a woman named Egeria traveled from the west. She is the very first she provides us the very first recorded pilgrim's account of travel from far away to this land for essentially touristic / pilgrimage purposes. And if anybody is interested in it, you can actually buy her manuscript. It's called Egeria's Travels, and it's this neat little book that is a translation of her account. She comes from, like I say, someplace in the West. She's traveled alone. She belonged to a community largely of women. She addresses herself periodically in her text to her sisters, and they can't all be simply relations. And she describes her great fortune at being able to travel from one end of this land to the other, and with guides. There are people who present themselves as guides to her, show her the various important sites. And in her travels, she comes to Capernaum. And about Capernaum, she writes, "The house of the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church with its original walls standing. It is where the Lord healed the paralytic," which is a story in Mark. And indeed, in the 4th century, the excavations here have shown that this complex, which essentially had remained just part of the village and a housing complex with this one single venerated hall, was turned into what's called a house church, the Domus Ecclesiae. And that's the second of the drawings on your plan. The central room was given a higher roof, and in order to accommodate that higher roof, an arched wall was built here across its middle. And here you see a reconstruction drawing of the Domus Ecclesiae and that arched room. And a perimeter wall was built enclosing the whole compound. And with that perimeter wall, access from the east — this is east actually, this is north in this direction — access from the east was closed off, and there were two doors, two entrances to the compound, one on the north and one on the south, which you see here in these views. And then from there, a very specific route was maintained in order to enter the house church. You could come up through here. An atrium was added to the east of the original venerated room, and you see the atrium here in Reconstruction. And from the atrium, you could walk into a sort of middle court and then eventually enter the venerated room. Although the entrances on the southern sides of it also remained intact. This is the architectural response in the era immediately, in the generation immediately after the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which of course is, 50 times this size, or could even be more. I mean, it's vast, obviously. This is a very modest architectural response. But what it acknowledges is that with the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, pilgrims will be coming to Palestine, to Syria Palestina. And when they do, many of them will probably want to come here to the site of Capernaum. And so the people who lived here chose to acknowledge that with this modest construction. But then about less than 100 years later, so just a couple generations later, apparently the onus for architectural elaboration became too much, and it is also likely, in addition, that with the adoption of Christianity by the Roman emperors, and what Constantine started, every subsequent emperor, except for a little blip under Julian in 361, every other subsequent Roman emperor continued building now churches and ignoring pagan temples and so on and so forth. With that, a whole class of Christian clergy with close ties to the Roman emperors grew up. And those clergy wanted larger, more impressive buildings to function in. And places like the Domus Ecclesiae at Capernaum, which were not really very impressive, quite unpretentious as a matter of fact, were converted wholesale. So the Domus Ecclesiae at Capernaum in the 5th century, in the middle of the 5th century, was essentially raised to the walls don't stand any more than a meter high of the original Domus Ecclesiae. And in the spot where it had been, foundations were laid for a new church, an octagonal church, so a very special, fancy church. This is the first octagonal church built here. The inside of the octagon, the inner octagon, which you see here, is almost identical to the size of the original venerated room, about 7 meters across. And it's enclosed within an outer octagon, but the outer perimeter of the octagonal church follows the lines of the Domus Ecclesiae of the 4th century. There were mosaics all in the ambulatory and also in the central octagon. The central octagon mosaic is a peacock, and shortly you'll see probably a very similar peacock from another church that we'll get to shortly. And these scenes here were scenes of life along the Nile, so water birds and flora and fauna that are associated with the Nile. And again, you'll see an image of something similar at another church down the road in a little while. So the octagonal church is built here in the 5th century. If you go to Capernaum today, sadly, you can no longer get a picture like this. I took this picture many years ago, but now there is a new church built on stilts above the octagonal church, and it looks a little bit like a bird coming in for a landing. It has sort of wings. It's a little odd. And it has a see-through floor in part where you can look down and see the octagonal church beneath it. So I guess they had to do something to protect it, and also to accommodate. There are, of course, thousands of pilgrims who come here every year, and people who are not pilgrims and just want to see the site. But anyway, yeah, you can't get a view like this anymore, so there you go. But of course, Jesus, when he came to Capernaum, he didn't go to a church. There was no church. Jesus was a Jew. He preached in the synagogue. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. And indeed, at Capernaum, there is a synagogue. Here you're looking at an aerial view of the Franciscan excavations in their early years. And here you see the area of the octagonal church. This is just part of the village. But here on what is the highest point of the village, although that's not saying a whole heck of a lot because it's basically flat. But anyway, it's a little bit higher than the rest of the town. You see a quite monumental edifice here now looking from the front. So this is the front of it. This is the back of it. So now you're looking from the front. And you see it here. Here is the entryway, 3 doors leading into the main hall. There is a large side hall to accommodate overflow crowds. It's made out of white limestone, and it is quite similar in design and size and orientation to the synagogues at Chorazin and Bar Am. Lindsay.
Yeah, that's the same synagogue. Those pictures.
This and this are the same synagogue?
They done something?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I guess they have. Yeah, I hadn't really noticed that. Yeah, this is, yes, I guess they put the tops of the doors back on. And also it looks like the middle, the wall of the, separating the side room from the main hall has been reconstructed in this picture. But yeah, it's the same synagogue. There's just one. It's not actually that big a place. So on the basis of this evidence, which is to say the evidence of the gospel accounts, early travelers and early scholars who came to Capernaum dated this synagogue to the 1st century CE and identified it as the synagogue in which Jesus taught. And people felt supported by that because of Egeria, who in 370, when she came to Capernaum, in addition to noting the church, the Domus Ecclesiae, the house church, said also, there is also the synagogue. So Egeria sees a synagogue here in the 4th century CE. The way in is up many stairs, and it is made of dressed stones. You might not call this many stairs, but anyway. And dressed stone meaning very nice carved stone. Now, when research in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and archaeological excavation of other synagogue sites in Galilee began, and synagogues very similar in style and plan to that of Capernaum were discovered at Chorazin and at Bar Am, but these synagogues were dated to the 3rd century CE on the basis of archaeological excavation and dating. The synagogue at Capernaum was redated. It had to have already been there by the time Egeria came because she says she sees something in the 4th century. So it could be 3rd century, and that would mean that the synagogue that Jesus preached in is underneath this synagogue or someplace else. People had noticed that the white limestone synagogue at Capernaum sits on top of a foundation of black basalt. In and of itself, that's not unreasonable to have a foundation course that's of local stone, and then the upper courses, the ones that you actually see, of the nice white limestone. But the synagogue actually sits, the white limestone synagogue sits unevenly on this black basalt foundation. It's not perfectly aligned. It's a little bit skewed. That made the Franciscans kind of suspicious. So in the latter part of the 1960s and early 1970s, when they began their excavation projects here at Capernaum, they decided to investigate the date of the synagogue. So they put 2 trenches inside the main hall. So here's the plan of the synagogue that you were just looking at. Here are the main doorways. There's the steps coming in. That black basalt line of foundation is along this edge. Here's the side hall. And they put 2 trenches 24 and 25, inside the main hall. And they discovered a black basalt paving, probably a courtyard paving, underneath with a considerable quantity of dirt that had been put in to raise the level. And inside, they found over 10,000 bronze coins of the 5th century CE. So what's going on at Capernaum? First of all, what does that archaeological evidence tell you about the synagogue? Correct. It cannot be from the 3rd century. Although I will say that when the Franciscans first published this, they were the only people who weren't bothered by it. Everybody else had a total heart attack. And you can still easily find articles by scholars twisting themselves into pretzel knots trying to come up with an explanation for how this could be. The floor was completely taken out and relaid, and when that was done, all these coins were put in somehow, for some reason. Can't really tell you why somebody would put 10,000 coins underneath the pavement then, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, most people have come around now to the idea that a synagogue of the style of the Chorazim and Baram and other Galilean synagogues was built here in the 5th century CE. Why? You might want to have a little chat. All right. Remember to turn my microphone back on. Okay, so this is very mysterioso. A, what is going on? What is going on here? Heard a lot of chatter. I would like to hear some conversation. Alan, what do you think?
Jewish population built a synagogue.
The Jewish population built a synagogue in response to the church. That's certainly possible. Of course, we have no idea who builds this, although you can suppose that in the 5th century, when the Octagonal Church is constructed, if not everybody in town is Christian, certainly a lot of the majority of the people who have some control over things are Christian. I'm not really sure what Jewish community would be living here with enough money to take over this plot of ground and build this large thing, nor am I quite sure why they would be doing it. So it's possible. It would be interesting to know exactly who was in charge of the construction. That we don't know. But the timing is, you're absolutely correct about. That this dates immediately after this and clearly is an architectural response to it. Lindsay?
Sort of that way where Christians or just village leaders trying to revamp the whole town's image, maybe in response to Judaism or whatever, and they're like, look, it's not as impressive as it is. Let's just, so that people can come and be like, wow, this is what Jesus was. It's really cool. No, maybe it wasn't that impressive.
Yeah, and in fact, that is the exact theory of one archaeologist who has written about this. I'm not sure how many other archaeologists have adopted this. He wrote his article in Hebrew, for one thing, and not that many. Most of the Israeli archaeologists don't like anything that's happening at Capernaum anymore, and most American archaeologists haven't read the article. But indeed, I think that he's exactly right, and that's exactly what's going on. The Christian fathers who would be here, who will have constructed this to accommodate many of the pilgrims, know that many of those pilgrims are coming not so much, or at least not solely, to see the house of Peter or a church, but to see the Gospels brought to life. Jesus went into a synagogue at Capernaum and prayed. So there's got to be a synagogue there for Jesus to go into. And indeed, the synagogue that had been there must not have been nearly as impressive, because it must have dated from the 1st century. It must have been more similar to the synagogue at Gamla, which is a relatively modest building.
Don't see, if they were going to rebuild something, though, at least my knowledge of
Well, they had a church right there. But that's a very interesting point because it bespeaks a certain kind of interpretation of what people were after. And in part doing that is, there's room for one religion here. It's our religion. We're in charge. We can do this, and we will. And certainly that has happened and does happen in many places. But the evidence here is therefore even more interesting because what it tells you is that that can't have been the way people were thinking.
I mean, I could see this as just like a tourist site. Like, this is what synagogues were like kind of look, but I cannot see people of faith building buildings. I mean, they would be like, why don't you think Jesus is Son of God? Like, why would they build a house?
Well, it is not completely clear that at this period in this region, Judaism and Christianity, there was not some intermediate space. It's not. I mean, there are developing separate infrastructures and separate ruling groups, but the fact that until the 5th century, the place of worship here at Capernaum was this quite modest house church. Suggests that, and at the same time as there was a synagogue here, suggests a very accommodating coexistence of these groups. And there's no reason to think that overnight that changed. There's no evidence that that changed overnight.
So there's a difference between peaceful coexistence, you do your thing, I'll do mine, and then like building someone a huge structure. I mean, that's a lot of money that's going to take to build that.
It is a lot of money. It's a lot of money and a very nice structure. Lindsay.
I'm sorry. I don't see it so much as they're building a synagogue for Jews who are living in the city and saying, here, come worship here, we just built you a nice synagogue. I see it more as they're just trying to sort of rebuild the old synagogue that was in the scriptures so that pilgrims coming in have something to see. And maybe no Jews are worshiping there, but at least the pilgrims can go in and be like, this is where Jesus was.
So that's Ben's point about how it's essentially a touristic spot, right? And that could well be. Let's look at some of the specific accoutrements that adorned this synagogue that is built in the 5th century. So the interior is pretty lavish. There are Corinthian capitals on the interior columns of the nave. That's very, very elaborate, much more elaborate than the interiors of the synagogues, the adjacent synagogues at Chorazin or up the road a piece at Bairam. The lintels of the doors are also very elaborated with carving, and many of the carvings bespeak motifs that are part of common Roman styles and currency. So here is a garland, a wreath with a sort of shell motif inside, and it's knotted at the bottom, and it's beautiful floral rosettes. And also here in this lintel block you have rosettes, but you also have grapes and pomegranates, so fruits of the land, very verdant. But there's also quite deliberate Jewish symbolism incorporated in the architectural decoration. So on the end of this lintel block is this wheeled cart in the shape of an Ionic temple with its wooden doors and its scalloped, its conch shell front. And that's the ark that would have held the books of the law, the Torah, that would have been, the cart was in these 3rd century and 4th century synagogues, which this is not, wheeled out. And the ark in this synagogue must have been made to be wheeled out as well. And this is a representation of that. In other words, it's a very specific invocation of this earlier type. Now, of course, what the people who built this in the 5th century didn't know is that the Chorazin and Baram and other Galilean synagogues that they were copying were not synagogues from the time of Jesus. But those were the earliest large synagogues to be seen. And so people who were living 200 years later assumed, well, those are very early and they are very large and magnificent. Surely the synagogue that Jesus would have worshipped in must have actually been like this, and this other one that we have is whatever. And so they built one that was very elaborate. You see here a 6-pointed star, which remains today a symbol of Judaism, Star of David. It is in this period, the Byzantine period, that it first shows up as a symbol, and incorporated on at least one of the Corinthian capitals. Instead of the final acanthus leaf here at the top, so here's a typical Corinthian capital with its upper acanthus leaf. And here is one with a menorah and an incense shovel to one side of the menorah, and this little curved thing right there is a shofar. It's the horn that is trumpeted in the synagogue once a year on a Jewish holiday. So in other words, whoever is building this is being very explicit in adorning the synagogue with symbols of Judaism, of Jewish worship and cult.
Two questions. One, how do you know that the population of the city was predominantly Christian? I guess the question. And also, where are there still Jewish people who are, if they say, are you a Christian? And then they will say, no, I'm not. Where are they? And when do you get the political tension between the two?
There are Jewish people living all over Galilee and Golan. I mean, this whole region is covered with villages and cities. Sepphoris remains a big city. Bet-Shan remains a big city. Caesarea Philippi is a big city at this time. And then in between them, there are hundreds of villages. And almost every village has a synagogue. So most of the population of this region is Jewish. So that was your second question. What was the first one? Oh, how do we know that the people who are living here are Christian? Well, we don't know what the majority of people were. We do know that with the exception of the synagogue, well, here at Capernaum, there's the synagogue that's built in the 5th century. Obviously, there was one earlier. And it becomes a pilgrimage spot. We have no explicit evidence about the makeup of the people who lived in the village. It is completely possible, even likely, that people who identify themselves as Jews, as well as people who identify themselves as Christians, as well as people who didn't feel the need to pick, lived here. But we don't have explicit evidence for it. When is there a big divide? That was your third question. Later. There's no evidence that there was any huge conflicts between Jews and Christians here until after. Well, I mean, I'm not even sure that you could point to real conflicts until the Abbasid or Fatimid period, which would be the 9th. That's the early Islamic periods of the 9th and the 10th centuries, when we actually get a third religion in the mix by then.
Do you get any inscriptions there that are, well, is it possible, I guess, that, I mean, the Roman Empire has fallen.
No. Roman Empire is alive and well.
Okay, well, all these new religious people are coming in, and their identity can feel threatened. So you feel
There's no evidence that new people are. This is all homegrown.
what about all pilgrimages?
Well, we have a few. I mean, we have a few pilgrims accounts. There's not any evidence that there's hundreds or thousands of pilgrims. There's no evidence on the ground for huge numbers of new people moving in, fighting, conflict. This is part and parcel of, I mean, by now we call it the Byzantine Empire. The capital is at Constantinople. There's an emperor.
Jews didn't feel like their identity was threatened by this new thing.
Well, let me get to the next site, and then you can answer that question for yourself. Did you had a question?
I don't know if we're about to get to it, but why were there 10,000 coins buried in the church?
Oh yeah, that is an interesting question, and I was just going to skip right over that. We don't really know why this is, but we do know that in synagogues and churches that are built in the 5th century AD in this region, this is very, very common. Underneath the floors, there are thousands of these itty-bitty bronze coins. They're worse than a penny. You know, they're just, and so they look to be some kind of foundation deposit. Yeah, sort of, yeah, something like that. But there's so many of them that they can't each be from individuals. They have to have been sort of dumped in. I mean, and it's a very weird phenomenon that a lot of people have written articles about, and if you're interested, I can put you onto them. But yeah, we don't know. It's obviously some deliberate, you know, whatever. No, Tom.
How old was the synagogue? Were there synagogues during the temple period?
Yes, there's a synagogue at Gamla. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, there's an actual synagogue that's been found at Gamla, and there's not really any reason to distrust the gospel accounts that Jesus preached in a synagogue. It's a very likely thing for him to have done. And it's not just one mention. There are multiple mentions. So there's now exactly what happens in these buildings, you know, whether they, in the temple period, worked the same way as synagogues worked after. That's another question. But they were buildings where people came together on a regular basis on the Sabbath. That's certain. All right, so here you see the synagogue at Capernaum, built in the 5th century as more or less as it looks today, and here in one of these swell reconstructions, the way it would have been with its elaborated columns and its clear story upper deck and windows high above. The site of Capernaum, which you see here in the distance, is just below the open-air mountain slope that is today called the Mount of the Beatitudes and had that reputation already in the Roman and the Byzantine period, called the Mount of the Beatitudes because it is the spot, according to the Gospels, where Jesus preached and uttered a series of blessings, or in Latin, Beatitudes, for all of the 1,000, in fact, 5,000 people who were reported to have gathered here. And it was in that area that increasing numbers, we suppose, of pilgrims started to come in this period. How then did Jews of the various villages who lived all through here react? How did they assert who they were in the face of this increasingly, well, I really don't want to overemphasize it, but anyway, this Christian presence. It's not that it's monumental. It's not that it's overpowering. It's not that there are more people or that they have more authority or more power than the Jews that live around here. It's just that now they're there. Before they weren't really so obvious. Now in here and there they are obvious. In the 5th and the 6th centuries, we have a lot of villages with synagogues. You saw synagogues of the 3rd century. They were built essentially in response to Roman temples. So the synagogues of Chorazim and Baram are built to the same size, architectural form, and plan of a Roman temple, such as the temple at Omrit or the temple at Kadesh or the temple of Banyas. After the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built, a new model of religious architecture is introduced, and that model is a large basilical building in which you go inside and worship inside. The Octagonal Church at Capernaum is built, and synagogues that are built at this time, except for the Capernaum one because it's deliberately made to look older, synagogues are built like, for example, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in the sense that they're basilical. They're a large structure. You go inside the structure, and the decoration is made to accommodate indoor spaces. So you don't have big columns with fancy capitals. Instead of, you start to get very elaborate mosaic floors. So here is the site of Beit Alpha, which is here in the southern part of the Jezreel Valley, not too far from Bet Shan. Here's Bet Shan right here, Bet Shan Scythopolis. And here you see a reconstruction drawing of the synagogue at Beit Alpha. And here, in the main hall, is a three-part mosaic floor, which you see a drawing of here. So there's an atrium and then an inner area. This is in plan. This is a tiny version of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in its plan. If you blow it up, that's what you get. And here in the main hall is this three-part mosaic. The central part of the mosaic, and I'm showing you Beit Alpha, and I have put a link on Web Vista to Beit Alpha, so you can read more about it and see more pictures. There are a number of 6th century synagogue sites with actually very similar mosaics. So the central portion of the Beit Alpha synagogue here is replicated at least 4 other synagogues of this period. You can probably tell right away what this is. It's the zodiac. It's the months, and it's all the signs of the months. So there's Gemini, the twins, and Cancer, the crab, and Leo, and Scorpio, and so on and so forth. I think this is Aquarius, Pisces, etc. Their names are in Hebrew. On the 4 corners are the seasons, spring, summer, winter, and fall, also in Hebrew. They're very simplistic style. And in the center is the sun god Helios, a.k.a. Apollo. Here is his golden sun ray crown. And here are, they might not look like this to you, but these are the 4 horses of the chariot of the sun. And you see the moon and the stars are falling. They're actually all falling down. So it's probably sunrise. And Apollo / Helios is on his way. You might wonder at the centrality of Greek deity and a Greek mythical explanation for sunrise being depicted as the centerpiece of this synagogue. And all I can tell you is it obviously didn't bother anybody because they did it. And like I say, this is one of 4 or 5 zodiac symbols on the floor. So you have an article, actually, a kind of long and complicated article, sorry, by Azania Dean in your course pack on images and how the rabbis of this period persuaded themselves that images were not only meaningless in terms of the specific cultural cachet they afforded. So this could be a Greek god, but it didn't mean that anybody here worshipped Greek gods or followed Greek religion. But also that this had nothing to do with the second commandment and its injunction against graven images. And the reasoning that the rabbis applied to this that allowed them to decorate their synagogues this way is explained in that article. On the top panel of the Ben.
The article, or anyway, does that apply to like houses too? And when do they start
He doesn't specifically talk about houses, but all of the reasoning would absolutely apply to houses. And we know that mosaic imagery, very dense and beautiful figural mosaic imagery, continued in the Byzantine period. At Sepphoris, for example, we have a fantastic house from the 5th century with a very elaborated mosaic.
Do you know when that kind of theological reasoning started?
It looks like it starts in the 4th and the 5th centuries. It's not possible to always date these rabbis specifically, but it starts around now, right around this period. The top panel in front of the apse of the synagogue shows what is by now a fixture of 6th century, 5th and 6th century synagogues, which is a fixed ark. So this apse would have held the ark of the law. And rather than having a wheeled cart, as is depicted anachronistically on the carved lintel at Capernaum, there was a closed receptacle, and that's what's depicted in the top panel here. So you see the ark with its decorated doors, and it's the eternal light is hanging down in front of it. There are 2 menorahs, just like the menorahs, like the menorah on the Capernaum column, and then all sorts of Jewish ceremonial paraphernalia. So here's a shofar, and here's an incense shovel, and here's a lute, and here's another one, incense shovel, shofar. And this is a palm branch for another one of the big holidays, the holiday of Sukkot. And here you see the curtains that would have been in front of the ark. Here are the curtains, and they've been drawn back so that you can actually see the ark here in the depiction. So, yeah, just to remind you, menorah, incense shovel, shofar, same little symbols. Lizzie.
Do you know what the significance of the animals are?
The lions of Judah.
Those are lions.
They are lions. Are you not scared? Well, we have an inscription here that names the people who made the mosaic. And they are Marianos and his son Hanina. And they ask that you hold them in their remembrance. So please do. They worked very hard on this, and they would like to get credit. And here is the answer to your question. This is the lowest panel. This is of the mosaic, and this is the one you would have seen when you walked in the door. 2 servants, a donkey, some branches and brush indicating that you're out in the countryside, a ram caught in a thicket, a man with a knife, a young boy, an altar with fire. What's the scene? Abraham and Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac. One of the most famous of, and in antiquity obviously also, scenes from the book of Genesis, when God tests Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his only child to him. And the story is here presented very faithfully to servants and with the donkey who would have carried the firewood and a burnt offering. And then he says to the servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. And here are the servants on one side. And then, when they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar, arranged the wood. And when he had bound Isaac and was about to slay him, an angel of the Lord called out to him, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied, do not lay a hand on the boy. And here you see the hand of God coming out from a little cloud, and it says in Hebrew, al tishloch, which means do not lay. That's the first 2 words of the phrase. And Abraham looked up, and in the thicket he saw a ram. Lindsay?
I'm sorry. The writing right underneath Abraham, is that Hebrew?
Yeah. It's all Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Yitzchak?
No, underneath
Oh.
Abraham.
Oh, this. Oh, this is Greek. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is the inscription of Marianos and his son Hanina.
Oh, so they wrote that.
Yeah, they wrote that in Greek. Sorry about that. Yeah. But all of the labeling of everything, this it says, behold the ram. It says here's Abraham, Al Tishloch, Yitzchak.
Was it just the style of the time to portray? I mean, because like you have mosaics from the same time in other cities in the Roman Empire,
And they look a lot better?
and they're beautiful.
Right. This is a tiny little town in the interior of the country, and they had local art, they used local help, local talent, either because if you go to Beit Alpha today, actually, there is, I encourage everybody to do this. Emily, have you done this? There is a really adorable video that you can watch, and it's this whole reenactment of Marianos and his son, and they and they're talking about the latest in synagogue mosaic styles, and they've seen these zodiacs at the synagogue at Tiberias, which is just up the road, and a bigger city and really nice, and they've gone and they're really impressed, and that's what they want to do, and so then they come home and they plan it all out. It's very cute. Yeah, it's just, the local guys. That's the problem. Or, whatever. The charm of it all. So what's the point of the story? The point of this story is that this is the start of the entire enterprise. So the Christians may have the spot where Jesus made his blessings, and they may have the spot where Jesus preached in the synagogue. But the Jews have an even older tradition. They have a deeper history, and they have the big God, the dad of Jesus, who made the promise to them. And that, of course, is the moral behind the story of the sacrifice, or the attempted sacrifice of Isaac. That then the Lord says to Abraham, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. Now, here's the thing that's, among the many things that's interesting about this, what's interesting also is at the sites at Capernaum, you have the actual spot. You have the power of place being commemorated. Where did this event supposedly take place? This event did not take place here at Little Beit Alpha up in the north. Oops. It took place here in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, of course, is off limits still to all of the people, the Jews who are living up here. But they have, in these stories, in their traditions, and in the deep antiquity of their past, an answer to the Christians who are living here. It's not a polemical answer. It's not an aggressive answer. It's just a response. Christians have these places that can be specifically associated with the life and teachings of Jesus. And the Jews have these texts that recall these older traditions. So whereas the Christians have the power of place, the Jews have the power of the past and those traditions. And that's their response. What was I going to do here? Oh, yeah. So, Yeah, so here was my point. So at the same time, when Beit Alpha is being built, this is Jerusalem, and has been now for a couple of hundred years. Beit Alpha is 6th century. It's 150 years after the construction of this, of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So you've got this great big city, this great big Roman city. What is being evoked is not reality. What is being alluded to is not what's there. It is what used to be, the past. This reconstruction of Jerusalem in the time of Solomon, which is already, of course, in biblical chronology much after the time of Abraham, with the original temple built on the mountain that had the rock upon which tradition held Abraham originally ascended with Isaac to make his sacrifice. All right, so now you have the stage set for the very last step in the transformation of this land and how all its constituent peoples choose to communicate with each other and to the outside world, to the increasing numbers of people who are starting to come. And that very last part of the story is what we will see on Tuesday.